conservation field?
My first job was with the Fish and Wildlife Service. It was offered to me by J. Clark Salyer III to go up to the Seney National Wildlife Refuge as a female waterfowl research biologist.
What year was that?
1947.
Wow.
It was at the San Antonio North American Wildlife Conference.
Okay, and then the only other thing is just tell me a little bit what you consider to be your area of expertise when you work for the service.
Waterfowl management and marsh ecology. And then I taught those subjects at the University of Michigan for several years on the graduate level.
Okay. When you joined the service in 1947, were there other women waterfowl biologists?
Not to my knowledge.
You were the first.
Which makes it more outstanding that Mr. Salyer literally stuck his neck out when he asked me if I would do that. And I was a fresh graduate, you know, really a master's degree, and I had gone to our Michigan State Game Division, where they knew me very well and knew my work and so on, thinking that, well, that's where I'll get my job. And the reply was, well, yes, I know you're well qualified, and sure, we'll find a place for you. You can go to conservation groups, you can write periodicals, you can go to school groups. I said, but that isn't what I'm trained for. That isn't what I want. I'm waterfowl marsh management. I did my thesis on it. Oh, well, Betty, I don't think we can't give you a job like that. And I said, why not? Well, he said, in the course of your work, you'd be out in the field. It might be necessary you spend overnight wherever you are, and you would have a male associate. So that was that, but it's to my dying regret that I didn't say, well, oh, goody. But I didn't. But I obviously didn't get the job. Then 2 months later at San Antonio, J. Clark Salyer III came up to me and asked me would I like to go up to the Seney Refuge as a waterfowl biologist.
How did Salyer know you? Or know you?
Well, that's another good question. He also was a graduate of the University of Michigan, but I didn't know him at that time. In fact, he graduated in zoology. That was his field. So it had to be, I don't know what. It had to be either our university background or my good looks. I decided it was the university background. Had to be.
So what was it like when you first went up to Seney as a field biologist?
It was absolutely wonderful for a lot of reasons. C.S. Johnson was the refuge manager, and in my book, there's nobody that's ever equaled him. Of course, I don't know all the refuge managers, but he was building the refuge. It was the old days when you didn't have a uniform, you didn't have a lot of protocol and red tape and directions. You did what you had to do, and he did it. He was from the Army. He had Army discipline, and he knew how to handle a shovel, and he did the work with the rest of us when it was necessary. And I can see him now. He wore a slouch fedora hat, an old brown jacket that opened in the front, some kind of Army issue pants, and then he wore those boots that had the strap around the top of them. And that was his uniform. And my conditions there were a bit unusual. Where I stayed overnight on the refuge where I lived was what we called the WPA shack. It was where they made the paychecks for the WPA crew. So there was nothing in it but one double iron bunk bed and an old wood burning stove and a trestle table and a bench. And when I say there was nothing else, I literally mean there was nothing else. Fortunately, there were a lot of bushes behind the building, and I wasn't too far from the main garage, which did have a restroom. And the refuge manager and his wife were kind enough once a week and went up there and took a bath.
So you didn't mind the primitive conditions up there?
I made up my mind, no matter what they threw at me, I was not going to murmur, and I didn't, because I felt this way. They'd opened the door a crack, my foot was in it, and I was going to go in the rest of the way. But I had to laugh because that Christmas, I got a note from CS, and he said, we got a Christmas present for you. When you come back, you'll see it. But no, he sent me a picture of them hauling an outhouse on the dredge to install at the back of my building, and that was my Christmas present. A beautiful outhouse.
Probably one of the best presents you ever had.
Absolutely, highly appreciated.
Did any of the employees have a hard time adjusting to working with a woman?
None of the male. The fellows took me just on equal. They took me as an equal. We got along beautifully, and also I was supervising one or two of them. For example, when we did the aquatic inventory, he didn't know the aquatic plants, which of course I did, so I was teaching him, and he took the instruction beautifully. The only problem I had actually was with the wives, and they were not always too happy to know that I was out in the field all day, and to, not overnight, but all day with their husbands. And I can remember we'd be doing an inventory of an impoundment, it'd be 4:30 or so, and I'd say, well, gee, we're almost done. Do you want to stay a little bit later so we can finish this one impoundment? And they'd say, sure. So, okay, we would, and then we'd put the canoe on top of the vehicle, and then have to drive through the streets of Germfeld at about 8 o'clock at night. That was the cause of some of the problems. But basically, everybody with whom I worked was just marvelous. And I had the support of Mr. Johnson. And the man who gave me my assignment was Richard Griffith, who was manager of habitat management out of Washington. And he was just marvelous. He came up the refuge 2 or 3 times and would check to see what I was doing and how I was making out. So he was great. And then, of course, I was there when Mr. J. Clark Salyer came on one of his annual inspection trips, and we kind of shuddered and shivered a little bit, but we managed to survive.
So what were you studying up there?
My main assignment was the relation of beaver to waterfowl management. So I set up various test areas and really worked hard at it, and I'm proud to say that it resulted in a publication which was printed in the Journal of Wildlife Management, and at the next meeting at the North American Wildlife Conference, it received honorable mention. So my main satisfaction was the fact that Mr. Salyer must have felt he was justified. That gave me a lot of satisfaction.
That's a great story. So how long were you up at Seney?
As an employee of the Fish and Wildlife Service, I was only there 3 years. But then I got a grant from the University of Michigan to continue my work up there on duck brood behavior. So I was there 2 more years, and that paper also was published in the journal. And then the time came, they were going to assign me to Lower Souris, which is paradise for a person that likes ducks. And Merrill Hammond was there as well. But in the meantime, romance had crept in, and I had to make a decision. So I reluctantly took the romance, although I'm very happy I did. But then they contacted me, and that's where that letter comes in. They asked me if I would, I don't know what you call temporary employment or something or other, out of the Ann Arbor office, and work there and not rewrite, but produce a layman's version. What was his name? Wilfred Banco, who did the Trumpet of Swan story, and they thought maybe it should be reduced a little bit for more popular consumption. So I worked all winter on that. So that must be what that letter was referring to, because we didn't have trumpeted swans then at Seney. Of course, now we do. Wonderful population. We've been very successful with that. So then it's kind of like a full cycle. I was away from that work. I went into another hobby, well, more than a hobby. I went into the fur trade history of Canada, the Hudson's Bay Company. And we spent a lot of time on that. We published a book on that. But then my husband died. I still live in Germfest, which is only 5 miles from the refuge. So I went back to the refuge, just like a full circle, and now I'm so happy. I'm back there. I work 3 or 4 days a week. And I do research, or I will produce that booklet, and we're working on grassland ecology, sharptails, and so on. And Tracy just told me this morning, well, I got a job for you as soon as you get back, is to work up a mailing list for our celebration on May the 24th. So I don't think I'll run out of work.
That is a great story, though. You coming back there?
Oh, and I love it. It's keeping me young. It really is. I wake up in the morning and I can hardly wait to get there.
Let's go back to the couple of years you worked at Seney, because we don't actually have great records in this period. What was a typical day like as a waterfowl biologist? What
Well,
did you do?
I had no hours. I mean, as a biologist, you do not keep office hours. So I'd be up at the crack of dawn and carry my pack sack and my spotting scope and my binoculars and my camera, and I'd take off and go to any one of these 4 areas that I'd set up for my studies. And then, of course, I conducted the waterfowl survey, since I was the only one there to do anything. I mean, I had to do everything. We were planting emergence along the edges of the dikes because they needed to be stabilized. See, the refuge was just being developed back then. So we needed to plant the emergence to prevent erosion. And I took the aquatic inventory surveys. And, and then I surveyed sharp-tail dancing grounds. And that was fun. Get up as early as daylight and then go out and stop and listen. And when you could hear the call, you would make a beeline for it. And that's how you discovered them. And I think I discovered about 14 leks, and of course mapped them. And but my hours were like from daylight. I normally would come in, maybe 11, 12 o'clock and write up some notes or identify some aquatic plants or something. Then I'd go out again about 3 and I'd come in at dark, 7 days a week. And then if we had any VIP visitors, I was the one elected to take them around, but it was...
Why were you elected to take them around?
There was nobody there. Well, Sunday, who was going to be there? I was living there, and I volunteered. I mean, and I also went and spoke to the history of the refuge to Rotary clubs and women's clubs, and of course then I dressed all up really pretty, and I drove the company Hudson. It was an old-fashioned Hudson 4-door long job, and I drove that to these various events. And of course I took a marvelous collection of slides, which I've given to the refuge, but they're of great value now because they show what it was like back in the 30s and 40s.
You mentioned how you dressed to go to the Rotary Club. How did you dress to do
Oh, I really... No, nobody had a uniform. Well, I had a pretty sharp outfit. It was white slacks and a tangerine blouse and a white jacket. And of course I had a nice tan. So it looked all right. And that's...
But what about the field? What did you wear in the field?
Oh, the field. Well, usually 90% of the time I was in hip boots. And even when I got out of them, I kept the belt with the straps on so that they'd be handy. And I call them suntans, you call them khakis, and a khaki shirt. Yeah. And that was it. I lived in that. That was how I don't think I even wore a cap. Maybe I did. And I hate hats, never wear them. But,
Hey, we got one last question for you.
okay.
This is George's question. He asked it in the last interview, and I thought that was such a good question, I'm going to steal it. And it was, in your career, what was your favorite place to be, your favorite experience in the outdoors?
You mean my career as a wildlife worker?
Yeah, let's say the wildlife worker.
Well, my favorite place was Seney Refuge. Well, number one, back in those days, we had ducks there. Not ducks like Surus, but we had nesting waterfowl. You could drive during the nesting season and the brood season. You drive along the dikes and you'd be seeing broods of ducklings, which unfortunately you're not seeing now. And it's very disturbing to me because the area is drying up. It's changing so in succession. But my favorite place was Seney, and my favorite work place was right in the middle of a marsh, listening to the birds and finding waterfowl nests and ducklings. That was it. I loved it.
That's a good answer.
It was other than marriage days, which were wonderful, and our experience with the fur trade was exhilarating, but actually that picture in the back page of the booklet exemplifies my happiest day.
I have to show this to you, George. It's a striking picture of a very young
I do have
female biologist.
I do have one question, though, maybe.
Yes.
Any comparison between the tools that you had to do research with in those days compared to now? Like
Oh, yes.
Good question.
Oh, yes. Well, to begin with, the office, for example, was one large room, 2 desks, strictly Army-issued desks. I mean, they were, you know, the metal type thing. CS sat at one, the clerk, Leo von Walt, sat at the other. I think they had 2 telephones. They might only have had one, and it was the kind that you hold like this. A mimeograph machine, the kind with this thing.
No, we don't know what that is. What is a mimeograph machine?
Well, it's a rotary, and when you use it, you get yourself smeared with ink because you can't do it without.
What about the tools you used as a waterfowl biologist?
Basically, it was my spotting scope and my binoculars. And and we didn't, word computer, we didn't know what, you know, nobody had that. And I remember, maybe some years after I was out of the field, they had a meeting of waterfowl people up in Duluth, Minnesota. And they invited me to attend, so I went and I sat there. And that's when I began to know the progress that had been made in the techniques. Because these younger biologists were speaking up and telling what they were doing. Many of them were trained at Delta, incidentally. And I remember the one that impressed me the most, they were injecting dye into the eggs of the ducks so as they hatched, they could follow them and so forth. And I thought that was just fantastic. But I remember I had, guts enough, I guess, to get up and say, well, that's fine, these techniques are fine, and we need them, and it's extending our knowledge. But don't forget, the bricks of waterfowl biology are the life histories. You've got to know your different ducks. You can't talk ducks, you have to talk species, and you have to know their life history. So I know that's fundamental, and you build on top of that, but just don't overlook it. So I got up and made my little speech.